He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even walking too fast. Just a well-dressed black man in a crisp navy blue suit, standing quietly at the edge of City Hall's marble steps, checking his phone, waiting. But sometimes, it's not about what you're doing. It's about what people think you're doing. And Officer Brent Dawson didn't need a reason, just a face, just a skin tone, just a moment to assume authority where it was never needed. "You don't belong here," he snapped. No greeting, no question, just a command loaded with judgment. Elijah Cole looked up slowly, a calm steadiness in his eyes. "Actually, officer," he began, voice polite but firm, "I do." But it was already too late. Dawson's hand rested on his holster, his voice louder now. "You want to try that again?" Onlookers began to pause. A few turned their heads. One woman near the fountain hesitated with her coffee midair. They didn't know what was happening yet, but they knew the pattern. A black man, a white cop, raised voices, one side assuming guilt before hearing a single word. Elijah didn't argue. He simply stood still. "I'm waiting for a meeting," he said. "Inside." He gestured softly to the building behind him. But the gesture only provoked Dawson more. "I said move," the officer shouted, stepping closer now, towering over him, eyes burning with something colder than authority. Discomfort. The kind that masks itself in commands. The kind that wants submission, not truth. "I'm not resisting," Elijah replied. "And I'm not moving because I've done nothing wrong." That's when it happened. Without warning, without pause, a fist, Dawson's, slammed into Elijah's cheek, knocking him sideways against the stone railing. Gasps broke out. Phones rose into the air, screens glowing. And in that single frozen frame you could see everything. Elijah's face, blood just beginning to surface on his lip. The crowd's horror. And Officer Dawson's chest still heaving, still convinced he had done the right thing. But what he didn't know, what no one there knew yet, was that Elijah Cole wasn't just another face in the crowd. He wasn't a visitor. He wasn't a protester. He wasn't a man who'd gotten lost outside the courthouse. He was about to be sworn in as the new mayor of the very city whose officer had just laid hands on him. And the moment that truth arrived, it would hit harder than any punch ever could. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story already has you thinking, hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with us. What happens next will shake the entire city. Elijah Cole didn't rise to power through noise. He wasn't a man who shouted to be heard. His strength came from silence, from restraint, from the kind of steady presence that made people lean in rather than step back. Born and raised just 2 blocks from where he now stood, Elijah knew these streets better than most. He had walked them as a child, holding his mother's hand, as a teenager keeping his head down, and as a young man chasing a law degree while working nights at the local diner. Nothing had been handed to him, but that was never the goal. He wasn't chasing status. He was chasing something harder to earn, respect. At 42, Elijah had already done what most wouldn't dare. He ran for mayor of a city that had never elected a black man to any office above school board, and he didn't do it with a flashy campaign or expensive billboards. He walked door to door, listened more than he spoke, showed up to the neighborhoods that hadn't seen a candidate in years. And when the election results came in, he didn't throw a celebration. He went home to his mother, now retired and soft-spoken, and held her hand in the living room. "We're in," he whispered. "We made it." The official swearing-in ceremony was scheduled for later that afternoon. Until then, Elijah had agreed to meet a small team inside City Hall to discuss his first week in office. He arrived early, out of habit. Dressed sharp, alone, no entourage, no press. Just him, a portfolio tucked beneath one arm, and the quiet resolve that had carried him through law school, community organizing, and every room that tried to make him feel small. He stood there on the steps, reading over notes, unaware that someone behind him was sizing him up, not as a leader, not as a man, but as a threat. Because even now, even as the mayor-elect, Elijah knew there were people in this city who still couldn't picture a black man in charge unless he was wearing a badge, carrying a mop, or standing behind a defendant's table. He just didn't know he was about to be punched for existing in a suit. And the officer standing behind him didn't know he had just laid hands on the very man this city had voted to trust. Change was coming. But first, there would be consequences. Officer Brent Dawson wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who didn't flinch when he raised his voice. At 38, he'd spent the better part of his career patrolling neighborhoods he never lived in, enforcing rules he barely believed in. And somewhere along the way, authority became less about safety and more about dominance. The badge, the uniform, the weapon on his hip, they weren't tools, they were armor. And the louder the world got about justice, the more tightly he held on to them. He'd never admit it aloud, but the city was changing, and it terrified him. New leaders, new rules, new faces in government offices that used to be predictable. People were asking questions, filing complaints, pulling out phones instead of lowering their heads. And while Dawson still believed he could control the streets with his voice, part of him feared that era was ending. That's what made him dangerous. A man in power who believes he's losing it doesn't get quieter. He gets louder. So when he saw Elijah standing alone on the steps, not moving when told, not looking guilty, not rushing to explain himself, his instincts didn't say pause or ask. They said push. There had been no radio call, no report of a disturbance, just a black man in a clean suit standing too still in a space Dawson didn't expect him to occupy. That was enough. Enough to provoke him. Enough to activate that twitch in his jaw. Enough to justify his presence, to himself, if not to anyone else. He stepped up, squared his shoulders, and demanded obedience, not out of law, but out of habit. What he didn't expect was stillness, not submission, not resistance, just quiet, dignified stillness. And that somehow infuriated him more. He needed this man to flinch, to fold, to validate the power he thought he still had. So when Elijah remained calm, when he responded without fear, Dawson snapped. The punch wasn't calculated. It wasn't tactical. It was emotional. And emotion, in a man like Dawson, never comes clean. When his fist made contact with Elijah's face, it wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. A man striking the very progress he couldn't comprehend. But it would be the last time he'd act without consequences. Because within minutes, he would realize the man he just hit wasn't a loiterer, a threat, or a non-compliant stranger. He had just assaulted the new mayor. And this time, the badge wouldn't save him. The air outside City Hall was still. Morning sunlight spilled across the stone steps, warming the concrete and catching glints off passing cars. A few pedestrians wandered past, too early for a crowd, too late to pretend they didn't see what was unfolding. Officer Dawson's voice had already risen twice, loud enough to turn heads, sharp enough to tighten stomachs. And Elijah Cole, standing tall in his navy suit, was still calm. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd lived this moment before. Just never as mayor. "Last warning," Dawson barked. His hand hovered near his belt, not on the weapon, but close enough to remind anyone watching that he could. Elijah didn't move. "I said I'm here for a meeting, inside this building." He pointed toward the front doors, even as tension knotted through his chest. He could feel eyes now, people watching from the sidewalk, a man across the street holding a coffee, a woman filming with careful hands. And then it happened. Dawson stepped forward faster than expected, grabbed Elijah's wrist, yanked him forward. And when Elijah resisted, not violently, just instinctively, pulling his arm back, the punch came like lightning. A thud, a gasp. Elijah reeled back, crashing into the cold stone pillar behind him. Blood touched the corner of his lip. One of his cufflinks skittered across the steps. For a second, no one moved. Not Dawson, not Elijah, not the crowd. The silence was explosive. Then, "Are you insane?" A city clerk bolted through the doors in heels, her face pale with panic. "What did you just do? That's the mayor. That's Elijah Cole." Time cracked. Officer Dawson's hand dropped from where it had hovered. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. The weight of her words dropped like lead. The mayor. Murmurs swept the crowd like wildfire. Cameras zoomed. People leaned forward, stunned. Someone whispered, "He just hit the mayor," and the words echoed as if shouted through a megaphone. Elijah, still reeling, wiped the blood with the back of his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't retaliate. He simply stood straight again, composed, still. And then he looked Dawson in the eyes, not with rage, but with certainty. "You just made a mistake you'll never walk away from." And in that moment, it was clear to everyone watching, the punch wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. It didn't take long for the video to hit the internet. In fact, it took just 43 minutes. A teenage girl who had been standing nearby uploaded the footage to her social media with 6 words that set the city ablaze. "He just hit the new mayor." The clip was under 30 seconds, grainy but undeniable. A black man standing calmly, a white officer lunging, a brutal punch, a woman screaming, "That's the mayor!" And Elijah Cole, bleeding but composed, standing tall like the strike hadn't just hit his jaw, but had awakened something far deeper. By noon, local news was at the scene. By 2 p.m., national anchors were asking questions. How did a mayor-elect get mistaken for a threat? What does this reveal about policing in small-town America? The city's official statement was short, hollow. "We are aware of the incident. An internal review is underway. But the people, they weren't waiting for a review. They had already decided." Outside City Hall, a crowd had begun to gather, slowly at first, then steadily rising by the hour. Some held signs. Others simply stood in silence. Formerly quiet neighbors were now shouting into microphones. "If this can happen to our mayor, what chance do the rest of us have?" The footage wasn't just a scandal. It was a mirror, and the reflection was uncomfortable. Elijah Cole, meanwhile, remained quiet. He refused interviews, refused camera lights. He stayed in his small apartment on the east side, tending to his bruised face and bruised spirit. But even there, the messages kept pouring in. Thousands of them. Some in rage, some in pain, but most in hope. "Thank you for not fighting back. Thank you for showing what dignity looks like under fire." And Officer Dawson? He had vanished, pulled from duty, placed under review, advised to avoid comment. But the silence only grew louder. His name was trending for all the wrong reasons, and every time the video played, slowed down, paused, shared, it stripped him of what he once wore with pride: control. The city had learned the truth, but what it would do with it, that was still unclear. Inside a quiet office, Elijah sat alone, staring at a copy of the news article someone had slid under his door. Mayor-elect Elijah Cole assaulted on City Hall steps. He didn't circle it. He didn't frame it. He just whispered, "Now they see." By the next morning, the crowd outside City Hall had doubled. By the end of the week, it wrapped around the building. They came with signs, with chants, with silence. Some wore suits, others wore scars, and all of them stood behind one name, Elijah Cole. Because if he could be hit like that, so could anyone, and maybe already had. The city tried to contain the damage with predictable measures. Officer Dawson was placed on administrative leave, which felt less like accountability and more like a coffee break. The mayor's office released a templated apology. "We regret the misunderstanding," but people weren't buying it. Not anymore, because it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, and now that pattern was cracking wide open. Within days, 3 former residents came forward with complaints about Officer Dawson: excessive force, fabricated charges, racial profiling. None had gone anywhere at the time. But now, with the world watching, those dusty files were being reopened. And as the city scrambled to spin the narrative, Elijah Cole stayed silent. Not because he was weak, because he was waiting to see who truly stood for justice, and who just stood for convenience. Inside his office, still temporary until the official swearing in, Elijah stared at a thick envelope on his desk. Inside was a proposed settlement, an offer: drop the case, sign a confidentiality clause, get a private apology, and move on quietly. He didn't touch it, didn't even open it, because he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. His bruised face had become a symbol, and symbols don't settle. The city expected him to speak through lawyers, or press releases, or in some quiet room where cameras couldn't find him. But Elijah Cole had other plans. He chose the very place he was struck, the City Hall steps, to say what needed to be said. No podium, no teleprompter, just a folding chair, a single microphone, and a voice that had spent years waiting to be heard. By the time he stepped out, the crowd was already waiting. Journalists packed shoulder to shoulder. Locals holding signs that read, "We stand with Elijah, and if he wasn't mayor, he'd be buried." Phones went up. A hush fell, and Elijah began. "I wasn't going to speak today," he said softly, "but I saw that envelope." He held up the unopened settlement, still sealed. "They said I could walk away, quietly, with a payment, and an apology behind closed doors." He looked around, not at the cameras, but at the people. But the punch wasn't private. The humiliation wasn't hidden. And the system that let it happen wasn't built in silence. It was built in plain sight. The crowd stirred, not with noise, but with energy. "I wasn't assaulted because I resisted," Elijah said, voice rising now. "I was assaulted because a man in uniform decided I didn't look like leadership, that I didn't belong where I stood, and if I had taken this deal," he raised the envelope again, "then I'd be telling every young black man in this city, stay quiet, take the money, and move on." He ripped it in half. The papers fluttered to the ground like broken promises. "I won't move on. I'll move forward, with every one of you." And in that moment, Elijah wasn't just a man healing from a bruise. He was a movement in a suit. No settlement, no silence, just the truth, spoken with fire. The punch was just the spark, but what followed was the fire. After Elijah's speech, the city could no longer pretend this was about one man and one moment. The people didn't want suspension. They didn't want a half-hearted apology. They wanted the truth, and they wanted it wide open. By the end of the week, an independent commission had been launched. Lawyers were called in. Civil rights groups volunteered their own investigators. And suddenly, every case tied to Officer Brent Dawson was under a microscope. What they found made silence impossible. Complaints that had been marked resolved without evidence. Body cam footage mysteriously lost. Victims with stories that sounded too familiar. A shove here, a slur there, a charge that never made sense. It wasn't just carelessness. It was a pattern of abuse, protected by silence and rubber-stamped by superiors. And for the first time, people in power started panicking. City officials who once praised the department's discipline were now dodging questions. Internal memos leaked, emails surfaced. The chief of the police tried to hold a press conference, but Elijah had already taken the spotlight, and this time he wasn't letting go. Instead of revenge, Elijah chose reform. He demanded a public hearing. He called for the department's disciplinary files to be opened. And most boldly, he proposed legislation that would require every misconduct complaint to be reviewed by an external civilian board. No more hiding behind the badge. No more officers policing themselves. Some council members pushed back, called it divisive, said it would undermine morale. But Elijah stood firm. If the truth breaks morale, he said plainly, then maybe it was built on the wrong things. And across the city, people nodded, because in Elijah's resistance, they saw a door finally cracking open, one that had been locked for decades. Injustice had knocked Elijah Cole to the ground, but instead of staying there, he rose with a pen in one hand and purpose in the other. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted laws, something that would last longer than headlines, something that would still stand long after bruises faded and protests thinned. And so he began writing, not just speeches, but bills, not just statements, but policies. His first order of business? The Civilian Truth Act, a motion that required every complaint against a city officer to be logged publicly within 30 days, whether upheld or dismissed. No more sealed files. No more silent transfers. Truth out in the open, where it belonged. Next came the duty to de-escalate clause. Officers were no longer permitted to interpret resistance without clear body cam evidence. And if footage went missing, automatic internal review. No exceptions. Some called it radical. Elijah called it overdue. And then came the hearing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was surgical, precise. The council chambers were full, activists, lawyers, mothers who had buried sons, men who had been stopped too many times to count. And Elijah sat at the center, not as a man seeking pity, but as a leader wielding pain like a lantern, showing every crack in the walls that once protected silence. He spoke not of himself, but of patterns. This isn't about me getting punched, he said. It's about what it exposed. Because if I can be mistaken for a threat, even in a suit on the steps of City Hall, then what happens to the kid walking home in a hoodie? A silence swept the room, not because people didn't believe him, but because they did. And just like that, the vote passed. The reforms began. Elijah had turned trauma into transformation. And somewhere inside the now empty office, where Officer Dawson once stood proud, the silence was no longer peaceful. It was a reckoning. Weeks later, the city looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The marble steps where a fist once flew were now where kids gathered to take photos, not out of protest, but pride. Inside City Hall, the walls whispered differently, because for the first time in the city's long, uneven history, the people didn't just elect a mayor, they followed him. Elijah Cole had never wanted to become a symbol, but sometimes you don't get to choose when history calls your name. He wore his scars without shame. He never once retaliated with hate, and because of that, everything changed. Officer Dawson, officially dismissed, his badge revoked, his record exposed. He wasn't a rogue cop, he was a warning, a lesson written in paperwork and pain. But Elijah didn't spend his time chasing retribution. He spent it mentoring, showing up to schools, holding space for those who never felt heard before. Every room he entered felt a little more just, because he was in it. And when asked how he found the strength to keep going, Elijah said something simple. Because I remembered that I didn't get hit alone. That punch landed on every man who's ever been mistaken for a threat just for breathing in the wrong zip code. I just happened to have cameras there to catch it. He paused, so I made sure it mattered. And it did. The mayoral office door now bore a small plaque. Not flashy, not gold, just black lettering etched into polished wood. This office belongs to the people, not the powerful. Before we go, tell us this. Where are you watching from? Have you ever seen someone judged before they spoke? Let us know in the comments. Share your truth. And if Elijah Cole's story hit your heart, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because these stories, they're not just fiction, they're reflections. Let's make sure no one gets hit in silence again.